So here is the scene of the crime. This is Willandra Lakes, and this is part of Willandra National Park. And so this place is a national heritage site. This is recognised by UNESCO, as is many sites around the world. And it's a very significant site because it is site to a series of dried up lakes that were prehistoric, and the most famous is Lake Mungo, and there's also Lake Garnpung, and these are the sites of, if we go here, you can see a little map of them here. These are the sites of some very important human fossils, so they've got names like WLH3 or WLH50, which just indicates which find it is really, like Willandra Lake hominid 3. It is a relatively simple abbreviation, but around 100 plus human fossils have been discovered around this sort of area, most of them dated between 20,000 to 40,000 years old. And if we go over to the painting, if I can click that little circle, very difficult to do it when you're off at an angle. What we're seeing here is an artist's interpretation of the burial of one of these fossils, perhaps the most famous one, known as Mungo Man, after the Lake Mungo. He was found near there, not to be confused with Mungo Jerry.
I was going to make a Mungo Jerry joke. I was just waiting for you to pause to do a Mungo Jerry joke.
He really likes the summertime for some reason. Yeah, he wasn't found with really big mutton chops either.
Oh,
so
shame.
I'm stealing all of your Mungo Jerry jokes here. But yes, he was found covered in red pigmentation all over his skin, which suggests he was deliberately covered in this red ochre as a form of burial rite. And that's one of the earliest examples we found of that in the world. Beforehand we thought burial rites were a relatively recent phenomena, but actually they could go back as far as, I believe, he's dated to around 40,000 years ago, somewhere in that ballpark. So
long before the last ice age.
Yes, very much so.
Tens of thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so they are full modern human. Homo
yeah,
sapien.
so anatomically modern.
Homo sapien.
Yeah, so anatomically modern humans came on the scene around 300,000 years ago from the archaeological evidence. That's with the Jebel Ehud skull in Morocco that they found.
That's the very, very earliest.
That's
one.
the earliest one. So it's pretty safe
there
to say
were other hominids.
Yes.
40,000 years ago, there were still other hominids. As
Absolutely.
Well.
Yeah.
Right.
So a safe boundary would be 250,000 years ago. It'd be safe to say, okay, that's when modern humans, as in biologically the same, existed. Obviously, they lived a very different life to we do now.
Like the earliest napped, like hand axes or whatever, are like 1 million years old or more.
So yeah, there are those sort of chopper tools that where
hand axe.
Yeah, where it's just rounded on one side to fit in the hand, and you've got a chopper. There was one found in Dmanisi in Georgia, which was dated about 1.8 million years ago.
Right, okay.
And that isn't even modern human. That's Homo erectus, one of our ancestors. That's not a human. That's not a Homo sapiens, which is our species. It's an entirely different one that we are descended from.
Like a half ape creature that was actually using a hand axe to.
Well, it was bipedal by that point. They're walking. They're sort of human in form, although different shaped skulls and different brain size, different level of intelligence, obviously. But that's not the important thing here.
Sorry, yeah.
There's also another find around these lakes called Mungo Lady, who was discovered in 1968 as one of the world's oldest cremations, and she was also found with ochre, but she died apparently, and then the corpse was burnt, then smashed, and then burnt a second time before covered in ochre. And the source of ochre, of course, isn't found locally. It's several hundred kilometres from the site, and so they'd obviously gone to great lengths to get hold of this and cover them in this substance. And it seems like there's a very I don't want to call it sophisticated, because I don't think smashing bones is necessarily sophisticated, but there was obviously some sort of procedure in place, because this would have happened over multiple days, I would imagine.
No, any sort of funerary rite, however primitive, is one of the things that separates us from the beasts.
Hmm. I think that Neanderthals buried their dead as well, and they're a separate species, if you will, from human beings. But this covering them in ochre suggested that they had ritualistic behaviours, and these were probably a product of either cultural or spiritual beliefs. So here's the skeleton of Mungo Man. He was discovered in 1974 by a team of archaeologists. He was estimated to be about 5'7" tall, or 170 centimetres. He was about 50 when he died. He had osteoarthritis in his lower spine, which would probably be very uncomfortable. And the carbon dating suggests he lived around 42,000 years ago, which makes him one of the oldest found in all of Australia. And, of course, by discovering this fossil, it helped understand the first people to live in Australia, because he's the oldest find. And supposedly, the current understanding is that people hopped islands from what is known now as Indonesia and Papua New Guinea to northern Australia. And at this time, around 50,000 to 55,000 years ago, they estimate, there were lots of other non-human hominids. So there were those Homo floresiensis, which are basically little hobbit people.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about them before on the website, haven't we? Where they hunted little tiny elephants. So they're like tiny people hunting tiny elephants. And they would have come across, depending on what period in history, potentially Denisovans, because they've got it mixed in, which is another hominid species, sort of the Asian equivalent to the Neanderthal, at risk of sounding very inaccurate for simplicity's sake. But they were a sort of comparable hominid species.
Fascinating that, if nothing else, pre-Homo sapien creatures were seafaring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, they sort of hopped islands.
Yeah.
I imagine they would have had very sort of primitive conical boats.
Yeah, it may be as simple as that, but still.
Maybe swam. Who knows?
Maybe. Probably not.
I would be surprised, especially from Timor to Northern Australia. That's quite a swim.
Yeah.
And to New Guinea there as well. But his DNA actually provided them with the ability to understand that the current day so-called Aboriginals are actually descended from this Mungo Man, and previous DNA analysis suggested that he was actually an extinct lineage of humans that were there before the ancestors of modern-day Aboriginals were. But new research, DNA research, suggested that the sample had been contaminated by European DNA, which sort of muddled the analysis, and they were able to isolate that European DNA from the researchers who'd handled it. Okay. And then actually analyse the DNA from the remains themselves, and that suggested that he was related to the Aboriginals. And so that gives us a more complete picture of the settlement of places like Australia, which is important for understanding all of human history, because of course how ancient humans settled various landmasses is important for us to understand ourselves. And I think that that's why I'm interested in this sort of thing, is that it's not only a window into human nature and what's always been important to us, but also it tells us a lot about who we are as a people, what our history is. And I think you've always got to have a certain amount of respect for those who came before, because it's important to ground you and situate you in the world that you currently live in. If you sort of are born and see it as a completely fresh start, you're going to be very isolated and alienated from the world, because it's such a complicated thing.
Is this one more nail in the out of Africa hypothesis?
Well, not necessarily. The out of Africa thing, they estimated around 70,000 years ago. So by 50,000 years ago, it was sort of well out either way. So it neither confirms nor denies it. It's sort of adjacent, although this theory does allow the existence of that hypothesis, I suppose. But Mungo Man was reburied, even though the analysis wasn't necessarily complete, because there were some Aboriginal groups that wanted him to be reburied. And so rather than keeping the fossil and relying on future techniques to do further analysis and potentially gather greater understanding, or displaying the fossil in a museum for other people to see, they buried it in the ground where it will decompose, because it's not in the right kind of soil, and it will forever be lost to humanity. It's just a piece of history gone. for no good reason.
Brilliant.
And now this seems like a bit of a downer note, but if you care about the preservation of your history, maybe you should go to lotuseaters.com and sign up to our website to help support our work so we can help preserve our history. And you can also do that by buying a t-shirt or a mug. These are limited edition. They're alongside our most recent edition of The Islander, which has sold out. So if you want to get the t-shirts before they sell out, here they are. But the Spectator Australia published an article talking about this because 108 Pleistocene, that's an era of history that goes up until the end of the Ice Age, 11,500 years ago, all the way to 2.8 million years ago. It's not Pleistocene, which you use to make models. Don't make that joke in the comments. I know someone wants to. But 108 of these fossils were reburied in a secret location by the Australian government a few weeks ago. Many of these fossils had never even undergone DNA analysis, let alone been subject to potential future techniques that we can use to understand them. So what this represents really is a massive sabotage of human history and our understanding of it. This is very important stuff. I actually really care about this sort of thing. I think it's very important to preserve history. It's a very underappreciated thing around the world. It's sort of the domain of Western Europeans and North Americans, really. I know other people are picking up on it, but we were the ones that really got people into it in the first place. And now to see Australia sort of turning its back on it is a real shame, because you'd think that they're of the stock that would understand the value of this more than anything else. And
they've been bullied into it by some Aboriginals.
Yeah, apparently so. But not all of them even wanted them to be reburied either, all the Aboriginal groups. Only some of them wanted them to be buried. Some wanted it like a keeping place where it was supervised by the Aboriginals, but they can be made available to researchers when needed and kept in safe conditions so they don't further decompose, which would be, I suppose, a compromise, but everyone would be able to get what they want there. So I could see no harm in it, even though it's not necessarily ideal in my mind. But the idea was abandoned because of a lack of funding, and they were also worried about how UNESCO might react. And here's a little quote. Jason Kelly, a Mufi member of the First People's Assembly of Victoria, accused the government of a criminal act against Indigenous groups, and he's opposing this reburial, saying that you're destroying our heritage, which I agree with. It should be seen in those in that light, in that they're ancient Aboriginals. They should be preserved, right, so everyone can have an understanding of them, not thrown back into the soil and decaying into nothingness. That doesn't seem to me to be responsible archaeology either. And speaking of which,
if that's what happens, they are destroyed by being reburied. Then
absolutely.
It's like putting them in a blender and throwing the dust to the wind.
It is
it's like
basically that, yeah.
Okay.
And here's, this is from a major archaeological journal. Whenever possible and where applicable, authors should indicate that they have consulted with descendant groups regarding the presentation of research results based on human remains. While careful descriptions of pathological lesions is essential to research in paleopathology, authors are encouraged to consider whether photographs of human remains are critical to the presentation of the research. If not essential, out of respect for descendant communities, they should be placed with drawings or included as supplementary material. So you can't even show pictures of the remains out of respect for the groups, which is just ridiculous. And as has been pointed out by this gentleman here, Mungo Man, who has done some great work talking about this sort of stuff and helped expose it to the world, really, says, if you see photos of crania in anthropological journals, save them. Not only are fossils disappearing, even photographs are being censored. So it's just a war on history, really. And it's a terrible shame, because here's one of the fossils that's been buried. It was put in an undisclosed location and put in a hole and covered with dirt. This is WLH50. Here he is showing some pictures of it. It's got a very interesting cranial shape here. You can see a little bit of the brow ridges there. It doesn't look that anatomically modern, does it? Which is interesting. Perhaps a question for science. The The huge cranium was 210 millimeters long and on average 16 millimeters thick. It had many archaic features, including a continuous brow ridge. Unlike most Australian fossils, the bone was completely replaced by silica, which is just talking about the fossilization process, I think. Here's a sort of reconstruction of it. I think you were able to see it just a second ago. Let's have a look. Where are you? Why is it not doing it? There we go. So you can have a rough idea of what it looked like. And it says, he's talking about how they likely contain DNA and how these are very important for analysis because, of course, this was, I think, off the top of my head, about 16,000 years old, this skull. And they had archaic features of hominids, sort of pre-Homo sapiens. And so surely it would be really interesting to look at their DNA and see how different were they? How distinct are they? How much has that been passed on to modern day Aboriginals? There are so many questions you can ask about this that will no longer be able to be answered by the fact that they buried it, which is tantamount to, going into, going to the Mona Lisa and smothering it in excrement or something. Or, I don't know, finding the last animal of a species or the last few animals of a species and just killing them. That's how I see this sort of thing. It's a really disgraceful thing.
It is weird and sort of inexplicable.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of, it doesn't make sense. Quite clearly, doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you? Why?
Well, it's pandering to these Aboriginal groups.
Is that the only?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the only reason?
Yes.
Some Aboriginal groups said we want them reburied, so they just said okay.
Mm-hmm. So, quickly going through this. There's also questions of how much Denisovan ancestry did the early Australians have, because these Denisovans were a distinct group from Homo sapiens, and they're named after finds in Denisova Cave in Russia, and Europeans and Middle Easterners have mixed with Neanderthals, about 2% of our DNA, whereas Asians, Australians, and natives to the Americas have Denisovan DNA, and I think Tibetans inherit their enhanced ability to oxidize their blood at high altitudes from the Denisovans, and the highest density existent today of Denisovan DNA is in Papua New Guinea and parts of Melanesia, where it's around 4 to 6% of their DNA. And questions are, did the Denisovans reach Australia, or were their genes brought there by mixing beforehand, who interbred, people who interbred and then migrated? I think the latter is probably the most likely, but we don't know. The DNA from these fossils were one of the only ways we could answer those sorts of questions. And there was a petition supporting some of the Aboriginals arguing for keeping it in a specific keeping place, as they called it, but it didn't exactly get much traction, which is a shame because it should have. And it's also worth mentioning as well that all of the Aboriginal groups prior to the 2000s were in favour of keeping the remains safe, but they were talking about keeping places, and then in January of 2001 there were the results of an academic study that was picked up on by an Australian newspaper that suggested that modern Aboriginals were not the descendants of Mungo Man, as we touched on before, but they actually did subsequent analysis and it was the case. Then all of a sudden their attitudes changed because it undermined their belief that they'd always been in that land. They were the first people there. And so now there's a section of the Aboriginal community, if you will, that opposes these things because they believe it's going to undermine their beliefs and basically their ability to grift from the Australian government. Because here, Mungo Manic points out, scientists were forbidden to study this specific fossil, WLH-135, which was 30,000 years old, and the fossil eroded and disintegrated, and then the Aboriginal Corporation received a lot of money for it. So I don't really understand why they're being financially rewarded for this. It seems like a perverse incentive. But to my mind, this is a massive destruction of human history. It's a real tragedy, a real... it's surrendering to ignorance, really. Because... maybe when we knew for certain we've got everything we possibly can, it can be returned. But I don't see how keeping it in a safe place is a bad thing. But what has effectively happened here is the destruction of history. and it's a really awful thing that's not really got much attention, but it should. If you would like to watch the full uncut version that is also uncensored, head on over to lotuseaters.com to find out more.